my work kind of bridges the gap between computer vision and ecology, environmental science, sustainability, and specifically around trying to monitor biodiversity. And, you know, why is that important? We're currently in the midst of what's being termed the 6th mass extinction. We're losing species at a faster rate right now than we were during the last extinction of the dinosaurs. So it's sort of an even more catastrophic extinction event than the dinosaurs' extinction. That is pretty astonishing and quite scary. We've actually lost, on average, around 68% of our species populations since just 1970. And there's lots of different theories or, you know, reasons why this might be happening. Climate change is a huge one. Human encroachment on wild animal habitats, shifts towards monocultural farming, you know, and just, you know, growing human populations are all really playing a role here. And, you know, I'm not the only person who wants to figure out how and why this is happening so that we could try to mitigate it. We could try to save some of the species we have left. Ecologists, biologists, zoologists have been studying biodiversity for hundreds of years. And I think the thing that really kind of brings me into this equation, and people like me who are working on the machine learning computer vision side, is that we've seen this massive explosion in biodiversity data that's being collected. And a lot of that is due to these really amazing hardware advances that have allowed us to collect data at a scale and a level of detail that were just really not possible before. And the data that people use to study biodiversity is very diverse. So, you know, this is just a few examples, but people use everything from satellite imagery to drones and low-flying aircraft, sensors that are placed on animals. So, you know, GPS trackers, for example, that will track an individual animal over the course of its migration. These networks of stationary sensors like camera traps, which are motion activated ground level cameras, or bioacoustic sensors that are collecting data passively over time. And then recently there's actually also been a huge increase in data coming from what's called community science, which is basically app-based data repositories where people can go out, like anyone who's interested in contributing can go out and take photos of plants and animals in the world around them. Those get identified to species by the community. And then they actually become research grade occurrence records in the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, so GBIF. And all that data is exciting because it means that for the first time, we're really getting a much more nuanced picture of what is going on with species loss. But unfortunately, the classic paradigm where an ecologist would, for example, go out, place some sensors, process the data to the point where they have, you know, species occurrences, for example. Sorry, a little sick. And then, you know, do some sort of statistical analysis looking at the coverage of those species. These days, like with the volume of data, it's just impossible. So I have a network of camera traps in Kenya. I'm so sorry. I have a network of camera traps in Kenya that collected 10 million images last year. And there's just no way, right? Like I can't label 10 million images. Community scientists have collected, actually, we just hit 100 million species observations in iNaturalist, which is huge. So like an aerial survey. So these are, for example, they're flying the largest scale aerial survey over Kenya and Tanzania right now to try to collect a population census, a count of the number of elephants across that sort of transnational area. One flight generates 200 terabytes of video. So essentially we need computer vision and machine learning. There's no way that we can actually extract the scientific insight that we need to extract from these huge volumes of data without automating the data processing. We just do not have the volume of experts that we need who are able to do this expert level identification at scale. But it's not super easy. So one, biodiversity data is just noisy, right? I don't know how many of you work in computer vision, but there are sort of these very common data sets that computer vision researchers tend to work with. Very simple ones like MNIST that are just, you know, handwritten digits, or things like ImageNet which is, a very large scale data set, 1 million images covering 1,000 categories. But all of those categories are images scraped from the internet that were taken by humans. And so what that means is that you actually have human intelligence in the data collection loop. You have a human who is pointing the camera at something of interest, making sure it's centered, well lit, and well focused. And that bias actually then gets reflected in the models that are trained on ImageNet data. Whereas if you're looking at biodiversity data from the camera trap, for example, there's no human in the loop. There's no human intelligence in the data capture. And that means that the things that we care about, the biodiversity there, can be really difficult to see. So for example, here you have a giraffe hidden behind a tree, another elephant hidden behind the tree. Here you'll have data quality that's quite poor due to weather or lighting conditions. And then you have a lot of data that's like empty. Basically something like triggered the motion trigger that wasn't an animal, something like waving grass or, a cloud moving in front of the sun. And that empty data can be sometimes 70, 80, even 90% of the data that's collected, which is incredibly mind-numbing to sort through. But it's actually potentially, if you could figure out the right way to extract the information from it efficiently, an amazing longitudinal picture at the way that the plants in the background are changing with environmental covariates. Biodiversity data also has a long tail. So this means that the vast majority of the data is for the most common species. And there's a lot of data that does not have very many examples of images or other types of, whatever data collection, audio. So if you just look at the first 16 million observations in iNaturalist, if you use the rule of thumb that you need about 100 image examples to be able to identify a species with a standard state-of-the-art machine learning model, which is a reasonable rule of thumb, you can see that there's, roughly 10,000 species that have enough data. And then there's an order of magnitude more species that are in that low shot regime. So you have to be able to learn from very few examples if you want to be able to identify all the species on Earth. And finally, and really insidiously, biodiversity data is just not IID. It's not independently and identically distributed, which is the fundamental assumption that we make with many machine learning models, that your training data and your test data are going to be sampled from the same distribution. Now, not only do we have, the fact that species are moving over time, that observations of species are highly spatiotemporally correlated because they're coming from all of these sort of covariates about habitat and parts of the world and movement possibility and human territory. But with climate change, those species distributions are changing rapidly, right? So even if you were able to capture a data set of all the species on Earth as it stands this year, next year that distribution would be different. That data would no longer be IID. And then on top of that, we actually have data bias as well, right? So if you look at where biodiversity exists on Earth, this is a map of alpha diversity, which is basically an estimate of the number of unique species that exist in any part of the world. You can see that most of the species on Earth are in the subequatorial tropics, in South America, in Southern Africa, and Southeast Asia. But if you actually look at where we have data in GBIF, which is like the largest scale biodiversity data repository, most of it's in North America, Europe, and Australia. And so, not only do we have bias in, where the objects of interest are, but we also have bias in our data collection. And so we have to be able to handle this domain shift problem effectively to be able to monitor biodiversity at scale. So first, I'll talk a little bit about that, ways that I and others have looked at trying to measure and overcome domain shift for biodiversity data. And we'll look mostly at static cameras, so these camera traps. And here's, an example of sort of the 22 million camera trap image records that were taken across the world and uploaded into what's called Wildlife Insights, which is a nonprofit affiliated with Google Research and a bunch of NGOs and conservation organizations that I work on the AI team for. And so one of the things that's very interesting about static sensors is that you don't only have the underlying distribution of species, you actually end up with a sensor-specific species distributions. So every single sensor will have not only sort of a distinct background, a distinct sort of orientation and the way that it interacts with the species that's very highly correlated over time. Due to the animal habits, you'll end up with unique distributions of species at a given sensor. So an example of this, we have one camera trap in Los Angeles that is 90% bobcat images. That's not because bobcats are common in the city of Los Angeles. It's because that camera trap just so happened to be placed near a bobcat den where a bobcat was living. And so we have just these repeated photos of a bobcat, which means that if you actually, use a standard machine learning model, you don't try to adjust or adapt for that prior, most of those bobcats get predicted as domestic cats because domestic cats are a much more common species and they look quite similar. And as a result, due to these, sensor-specific domain shifts, both visual and subpopulation shifts, we find that models just don't generalize, even in ways that you might expect them to. So if you have a bunch of sensors in the same regions covering the same set of species, what you'll see is that if you train on a subset of those sensors and then evaluate on the other sensors in that same region, that same set of species, you see a significant drop-off in performance across the class set, regardless of whether you have a lot of examples of a given species or just a few. And we found that these types of domain shifts, distribution shifts are really ubiquitous in any real world application. Essentially, once you move out of the space of data that humans upload to the internet and into the space of data that's collected in the real world where there is just inevitably some sort of spatiotemporal structure, then what you have is a situation where models do not perform when evaluated on any data that's sort of from a different country, from a different time, from a different end user, from a different hospital, you name it. And so I worked with a bunch of really amazing researchers to release these large-scale cross-domain benchmarks for domain generalization, specifically focused on real-world examples. But so how do we close this gap for static sensors? So one thing, it's kind of intuitive, but works astonishingly well, is if you try to reduce some of the impact of the static background by changing to localization instead of, classification. So instead of, saying what species is in this image, you do detection. You find the species within the image and then you categorize it. That gives the model a little bit more information about foreground background disambiguation and makes it memorize the background a bit less. And then also importantly, there is this trade-off between granularity and robustness that we found. So if you don't make the model predict to the species level, but you instead walk up the taxonomic tree and just make it predict animal, specifically animal, human, and vehicle, these levels of granularity are coarse enough that we found that the model does actually then generalize to parts of the world, habitats, and species that were never seen during training. So there seems to be this pretty significant trade-off between generalization ability and basically the challenge or the level of granularity of the problem that you're trying to get machine learning to solve. But because we did find that there was this sort of off-the-shelf model that we could build that would generalize, even though it didn't necessarily solve anyone's problem all the way, we could still find all of the images that had animals and localize those animals quite accurately and robustly. I worked with Microsoft to publish this model, and it's now being used by actually now 60 different NGOs worldwide. We processed 100 million images last year. And it's essentially, I think, one of the best examples of machine learning being actively used for real world impact in one of these types of problems. And I think the really important thing here is that if you very carefully construct your evaluation set to make sure that you're being really honest about what is possible, how the model's actually going to be used in the real world, and where there are or are not gaps in that, then you can figure out what will be truly useful. Because I can't even tell you how many different machine learning papers I've reviewed or read where people make these crazy claims about near perfect accuracy, and really all they've done is memorized some sort of data poisoned, correlated small data set that does not actually lead to the impact that they're claiming. And so a few examples of how this model is being used. It's used by the Idaho Department of Fish and Game to process their 11 million camera trap images per year. And now humans have to review less than 15% of that data, which means for the first time since in the history of their camera trapping program, they can actually label the data within the year that it was collected, which is huge because it means that they're making real-time conservation decisions based on data that's recent instead of data that's 5 years out of date. Another example is Wildlife Protection Solutions. Actually has these cameras connected to the cloud, and they're detecting wildlife threats, poaching or human-wildlife conflict threats in real time. And they estimate they detect about 1 real wildlife threat per week using our models. To go beyond, the sort of disappointing, like, yes, okay, we can't categorize your species, but we can find the images off the shelf. We built sort of a domain-aware active learning process that relies on the mega detector and relies on the visual similarity across species within a given camera, and has humans just ID clusters, representative samples from clusters per sensor. And we find we can get the same machine learning accuracy with around 99.5% fewer labels. So, for a given new set of millions of images, there are ways that you can build these interactive approaches that take like an active learning step and give you good results for a large set of data. And then similarly, this is work from actually some of my friends at Caltech, not work that I was on, but I think it's awesome. There are ways that people have demonstrated that you can actually learn a spatiotemporal prior to provide some of that context to the model. So here they're learning an image classifier and then separately learning a prior over where and when a species is likely to be seen globally. And then they combine that, taking just a simple Bayesian step. And they show that they can get around a 10% accuracy increase on iNaturalist data classification. So in community science data. Similarly, you can use this same spatiotemporal context to help select more diverse positive pairs for self-supervised learning and build more robust representations for data that was never seen during training or doesn't actually have labels. Cool. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about learning from imperfect data, and I'll go through this kind of quickly. So, rare classes are hard. Things that you don't see very commonly can be very difficult. One of the things we've looked at is actually improving performance on these rare classes using a combination of synthetic data generated from gaming engines and generative adversarial networks. We find that we can improve that accuracy by up to 70% on a rare category without actually affecting the performance of the common categories that you don't have synthetic data for. How would an expert label an image like this? Super hard. If you just look at one potential object, it's really difficult from this image alone to tell what's going on. But what we found is that experts are giving us accurate labels for these difficult images, and they're doing it based on spatiotemporal context. And they'll look at, not just within a small time horizon, but sometimes up to a month of data. They're actually understanding, what species are likely to be here, what shape, what size are they, is this actually a tree in the background we see consistently, or is it an animal because it's changing over time? And they were able to confidently ID this object as a wildebeest, but that would have been impossible without that long-term context. And so what we did is we actually designed a two-stage model that incorporates this sort of long-term temporal information using attention. So you first construct a bank of memories that's representative from a single sensor of what is likely to be seen, even from sensors that were not seen during training. And then when you're actually doing inference, you incorporate that information using an attention block. We find that that approach significantly improves performance over a single frame model, which is not so surprising because honestly, it's a very hard problem from single frames alone. But the cool thing about attention is it's adaptive. So you can essentially, you can find what's useful as opposed to any sort of hard heuristic that says, oh, look within a minute or something. And so, in the first example here, there's a warthog that uses the same game trail over and over again up to a month. There, the information gets extracted from that month of data. And the confidence improves, whereas in the bottom, the sort of most useful information is all the same gazelle who's just hanging out in front of that camera for hours grazing. And qualitatively, we find that this does actually improve on stuff that's hard. So things like animals entering the frame, animals that are hidden behind trees, and ones that are very poorly lit. Okay, so last, I'm going to just touch on some of the ways that we're deploying these types of human AI systems, these interactive approaches in the real world for conservation. So one, we have a system that's deployed in the greater Mara ecosystem in southern Kenya. That's essentially a joint human AI system for recognizing individual elephants based on attribute coding plus the contours of their ears. And here, the thing that I like about it so much is that it's a system that doesn't require you to have training data up front to be able to use computer vision or use automated approaches. So we initially rely heavily on this very nice, good data management platform we built that allows humans to capture images of elephants, upload them, and identify them based on human-driven attributes. These are defined by pachydermists, people who study elephants, using this coding system that they've had in place for a few years. And then as we build up enough data to be able to train and, more importantly, evaluate automated systems, then we can start incorporating computer vision into this. And what we found is that actually the combination of computer vision and that human intelligence outperforms either of the two. And now we're moving more and more towards a more interactive system where the model actually explicitly queries information that it's interested in or information that it needs to make an accurate decision. We've also looked at trying to automate escapement estimation and sonar for sustainable fisheries. So here, this is essentially a multi-object tracking problem, but one where there's almost no visual re-identifiability across frames for an individual. So, it's not like multi-object tracking of cars or pedestrians where you're really re-identifying their visual characteristics most strongly. And people have shown that you can randomly sort the images in a video and get very similar multi-object tracking performance with classic approaches. But here, you don't have that information. So most of the information is purely movement-based. And we're looking at essentially here trying to make sure that enough salmon have escaped upstream when you open the fishery industries, like say in Bristol Bay, which is a multi-billion-dollar fishing industry in Alaska, that you can guarantee that they'll spawn and there'll be enough salmon then who go out to sea and come back in 3 years so that the fishing industry can remain stable. And finally, we're really interested in efficiently answering novel ecological questions. So, I talked a lot about how people are, identifying species, for example, or identifying individuals of a species, but essentially there's so many interesting scientific questions we might want to ask from data like this. And what ends up happening is I give someone a species identification model, they immediately come back and say, oh, could you tell me how old all of the animals are? Could you tell me if they're healthy? Do they have a specific disease? What are they doing? And so we've been looking at representation learning that can be efficiently adapted to novel tasks, basically trying to enable more nuanced and kind of diverse exploration of these amazing and very large scale media collections, like the 100 million species observations in our naturalist. And then this is just work of my friends that I want to plug because it's really cool. He's been working on recognizing birdsong from audio and actually has this deployed on a free app now that you can download to your phone called Merlin. And essentially now it runs on your phone, it's super lightweight, and in real time, it shows you the sonogram and the identification of birds just in your neighborhood. And it now works in the US and in Europe. So if you're interested in birds, I would definitely recommend this. I think it's really cool. Awesome. So yeah, I think that's good for now. I'm happy to answer questions. I have some other open challenges slides we could go through, but I feel like that's sufficient.
Thank you very much for giving us an overview of your research. Then I have a couple of questions. If you have a few minutes. The first one is about the adoption of these technologies.
Yeah.
When we think about AI for health, finance, or autonomous driving, we're always scared about black box models that have lack of interpretability or don't have theoretical guarantees. are problems like these also affecting the application of these models in such spaces, or not that much?
Oh, of course, right? I mean, and especially as you move towards more higher and higher risk scenarios. So an example of this, some of the people using our models are, it's an organization called Island Conservation. And they're trying to detect in real time invasive rodents on islands. And basically, if you miss a single rodent, it will breed very quickly and they will just devastate local bird populations. And so the risks essentially for these islands of false negatives are very high. We work very directly with stakeholders to try to both really robustly evaluate these methods on their data to understand what the failure points might be, to try to provide as much interpretability as we can. And I do think that more detailed machine learning model, so like a detection model, actually does give a little bit more interpretability to a user than a classification model, because it's clear, like if it's detected a rock, right, you understand like what's going on slightly more. Now, there's still a ton of nuance there. There are no robust guarantees, but we work really really closely with stakeholders to make sure that they understand the risks and that they are basically trading off the amount of human verification and quality control and like, systemic retraining with their level of risk. And so, yeah, I think that's different for any end user, but I think that this is something that's very important to have nuanced conversations about. It's important to understand the domains that you're working in to start understanding what those risks might be. And also, I think this is one of the biggest issues that I have with the sort of current state of, computer vision, where people train these models on these easy ass data sets, say that they work perfectly, essentially. And then people who are not experts in machine learning trust that hype and try to use it in these high risk scenarios. So I think we all just need to be much more careful and much more scientific in the evaluation of our methods, and try to push back against the need for everything to be perfect accuracy to be published, and instead move towards a space of more academic honesty, I think.
Thank you. Thank you a lot. The second question is a bit more technical, and it's about out-of-distribution generalization, which I guess is a big issue also in the evaluation phase of these methods. And I was wondering whether recent causal techniques are used in this area that distinguish between causal mechanisms that are shared across environments and different mechanisms like the background color that may not be shared.
I think it's really interesting. There's been some really preliminary, I've seen like discussions around this type of thing. I think it could be very useful. I will say that kind of shockingly, at least for me, with the wilds benchmark, for example, ERM is still outperforming like basically every state-of-the-art method. So I think that really points to that, like, in the development of all of these methods, people have been working on these like fake domain shifts. They like subsample data from a given data set in ways that try to simulate what might be a type of domain shift, but actually in the real world, the domain shifts we see are more complex. But I think that's the point of like generating some of these benchmarks that are easy for people to interact with and easy to use. One of the things that I find really annoying though is that what I keep seeing is papers that publish on the wilds data set, but they pick and choose what subsets of that benchmark they report results for. So it's like, obviously they're like, oh, we tried this on 3 of the 7 benchmark data sets and we find that it works very well. And you're like, it's so easy to try it on all of them that that they tried it on all of them and picked the ones that worked for. And I think it would be much more interesting to really understand what things are and are not working for if you actually publish negative results as well. But I understand that it's harder to get that published. So.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Thank you a lot.
Yeah. I do think the causal stuff is really interesting. I think from like also from an interpretability perspective, I think that could be really, really useful.
Yeah. About what you said before, about removing the background that lead to good improvements, that could be seen probably as an heuristic to exclude the spurious features from the estimators. So yeah.
But it's actually interesting, right? Because some of it is spurious correlations, but some of it is actually like useful correlations, right? Like, what of the correlations are actually causal, right? You know?
Yes.
So yeah.
Thanks again, Sara, for the really interesting talk. Does your research work? So do you go also in the field? Do you because it sounds like super adventurous in a way.
Yeah, I got back from the field in Kenya a couple days ago. I tend to go to the field about twice a year, and for me the field is, well, we have these 2 projects deployed in Kenya. We have deployments with the fishery stuff from Alaska down to California across the coasts, and so depending, you know, I think a lot of people work on domains, but they kind of do this thing where there's like a fence and you're like the domain experts throw data over the fence to machine learning people. We work on solutions, you like throw the solution back over. But I actually think that usually leads to a lot of weirdly like slowdown in the progress, because it means that you often don't understand the nuances of the data or the data collection, and you don't understand the needs as well. And so for me, I go to the field, I bring my students to the field, because I think every time we go, we come back with really interesting novel insight around what's needed and what's possible, and interesting new research ideas.
Cool. Nice.
Lorraine?
Yes, hello, Sara. So yeah, we have just started to work together on the penguins' work. So if it's possible, or if we have an idea of how we can use deep learning and all of this to try to avoid the poacher with the game reserve. And because it could be acoustic, it could be camera trap. But I don't know if you are working on this kind of trouble.
So I actually get really nervous about the ethical considerations involved when you're talking about the militarization or the policing of conservation areas, because if you do detect or catch, you know, individual poachers in a game reserve, it's depending on the country that you're in. I mean, usually those people are not the ones driving poaching. It's usually very complicated economic systems that are driving, you know, the need to either poach animals for bushmeat to feed their families, or where there's financial incentives that are coming in from these sort of black market poaching rings that are usually not even located on the continent. So I don't work actively on like detection and like anti-poaching, because I'm not convinced that it's like that ethical gray area is like well established. And you know, so me personally, no, there actually are a lot of people specifically working on this. The ZSL is building a camera trap that essentially is a metal detector that's edge-based and is real-time connected, and is detecting metal as a more reliable way to detect potential poachers. And then also there's Eric Dinerstein has a company where they're developing something they call a trail guard, which is essentially a camera trap that's very easy to hide and is explicitly detecting poachers. So there are people who are actively working on this, but it's just something that like makes me super uncomfortable. So I don't work on it directly.
Okay, nice, thank you.
Hi, thanks for the interesting talk. Well, I'm working on ecological networks. I am a third-year PhD student in data science for biology and ecology. Are there some projects on the extraction of interaction data from camera traps on multi-object, maybe at the resolution of the family, just to obtain general data about taxa interactions?
Yeah, I mean, so there's definitely people interested in interspecies interactions and within species interactions on the animal behavior side. I think the like neuroscientific community and people working on lab animals have been much further along on this traditionally, but that's now moving more and more into the wild animal space. And it's not something I've worked on like actively, but I do think that say you have, camera traps taking video, and it's taking video, at a motion capture, and you have tons and tons and tons of data. Even if you're just able to pull out the images that have animals and then, categorize the species to be able to pull out images that have multiple species in them, then it's already going to save you a ton of time when you're thinking about your analysis of your interaction data, and being able to kind of scale that down to something that's parsable in the meantime, while we sort of move towards trying to fully automate some of those methods.
Yeah, hi Sarah, thanks for the presentation. I was wondering if you had like any previous experience before doing the PhD in this field, like in computer vision, but also in computer vision related to environment and biodiversity.
Yeah, so like someone brought up at the beginning, my first career was in ballet, so professional ballet. And when I was sort of deciding to retire from professional ballet, I really wanted to work on something that was like intrinsically motivating for me. So I wanted to work on, environmental sustainability, potentially the shift to green energy. So I decided to study electrical engineering in undergrad. So I went to start my electrical engineering degree, and it just, one of those weird luck of the draw things. I ended up meeting an amazing mentor who was the chair of the electrical engineering department, who did have a computer vision background, much more traditional, like in the signal processing sense. And she had just started work with Panthera, which is a big cat conservancy, on recognizing individual snow leopards in images. So kind of my first exposure to research was already in this space. And I'd say I kind of just got the bug from that. Not only did I think it was really, computer vision was really interestingly artistic and creative, versus some of the other areas of research that I'd interacted with. I liked the visual aspects, but I liked that it was so strongly mathematical. But also it was so well aligned with my own personal, like, intrinsic motivation, my own personal interest to work on something that really had like an environmental impact. And I could also see how much potential there was, like far beyond, recognizing individual snow leopards. I could see that this was actually really going to change the way that we monitored the environment globally. So I kind of took that project and ran with it. And by the time that I applied for graduate school, like my NSF GRFP, for example, was very clearly like, I want to work on, computer vision for biodiversity monitoring. And I've been pretty stubborn about it, and still do that. So, but yeah, it was something that I had experience with from my freshman year of undergrad, and has really been a driving force for my research.
Yeah, that's cool, thanks. But then do you have like any recommendation to, where to start with if I am like a master student?
Yeah, so I have a Slack channel. It's got like almost 1,000 people in it globally, called AI for Conservation. Really kind and open and amazingly supportive community. And you can say, hey, I'm interested in learning more about this. You can just lurk for a while, or you can, if you're interested in volunteering on a project, potentially you could post about it and there might be some interest. Bill Gunnar?
Congratulations on getting your PhD. I've been following your research on Twitter and, off Twitter. I was just wondering, so my background is my PhD is in molecular ecology, and I also been working on biodiversity monitoring, just using different tools, next generation sequencing and, other sequencing technologies. I was just wondering what your biodiversity data sets comprises of. Like, do you rely on, or do you work with eDNA scientists, eDNA being environmental DNA, and or do you have plans to integrate that kind of data sets in the future?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of my hope for my future lab that's going to be at the intersection of these spaces is to really be looking at automating this monitoring, but across modalities. And so far, mostly we've worked with imaging or things that can sort of be translated to imaging, like audio. But I think there's a ton of potential around eDNA, specifically when I think about global scale verification of models. So say we have, some, global scale predictions of species distributions. How do you actively, or how do you like reasonably understand where those models are uncertain or understand the uncertainty of those models, and how do you go out and collect targeted data for verification. And I think because of kind of the scope at which you get, coverage over species sets with eDNA, I think it can be incredibly valuable on that side. I think until we move towards, much more like easily processed eDNA, and like the nanopores and stuff are moving that way, then, we might start seeing more scale. But I think right now eDNA is still essentially more expensive to collect at scale, whether that's spatial scale or temporal scale. So I think it makes a lot of sense as a component of a system, but I don't know that we could like move to only eDNA based monitoring. I actually think that one of the cool things about this is like really the only way to scale up is going to be kind of bringing together lots of modalities of data. I also think eDNA is a really amazing tool for like ground truthing individual ID.
Well, you can do barcoding as well, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
For species that are not as easy to individually identify, if we're trying to understand if we can automate that identification, I think that we need a different way to ground truth. And so, for example, we work a bit in Kenya with they have an eDNA lab that's up and running at Impala Research Center. And so sometimes we kind of use genetic like barcoding and eDNA as verification there.
That's very cool.
Yeah. Julia, you asked a question.
Sara and I were together on the job market this season. And so I just wanted to ask if you have, any advice for people that might enter in the job market in the next few years, how you like it, what you did like, what you did not like. And I don't know if everybody here is PhD. No, I think we have at least some masters, but like if you have, any vision about your lab, the kind of people you would like to bring in and their background.
Yeah. No, so I mean, I don't know. I know, so Julia, right, is obviously amazing and made a decision like a month ago, and I'm super jealous. I would say one of the things that's been really, really hard for me on the market is decision making. So I got way more and better offers than I anticipated, which is obviously an amazing problem to have. But they're all quite different. And I think, especially as a woman and like an openly queer woman who like cares a lot about DEI and is like really actively wants to see change in academia in terms of like who has access and who gets to be a part of academic spaces. I think one of the things that was a bit of a bummer about the job market was just kind of realizing how bad it still is everywhere along those lines, right? And how much of a fight that's going to be throughout my career. That's okay. It's a fight that I think is important and I'm willing to undertake. But yeah, I think I was sort of shocked by some of like the background, like the aspects of meeting with all these different people and some of the comments that were made, just like, wow, that's really old school. Like I did not expect to hear that. The good things I think about the job market were, besides a few like weird comments here and there, it was really exciting to get to meet that many people in so many different areas of science and get to like talk about my work. And I think one of the things that I hadn't really appreciated going in was, how many interesting and like meaty research ideas I was going to get out of just talking to people. And so I have, now like this huge, set of cool ideas for things that I could do with my future lab that just came out of these interesting conversations and a lot of potential collaborators. I think that was really special. Yeah, if you're going into the job market, everyone tells you it's gonna like take over your life. And I kind of expect it to, but it really took over my life. I feel like I haven't done anything useful in 6 months, and I'm really ready to get back to work. I think it's good time spent, but I'll say, yeah, I think I would say just like believe people when they like just plan for it to be the only thing you do. Don't try to do other stuff too, because it's just, you're going to burn yourself out. And also start early. Like, it's June. If you're going on the market this year, like start writing your materials now, because you're going to be much happier feeling prepared and, thinking about your letter writers and kind of just not feeling like you're scrambling in October and November.
Yeah, I want to,
does anyone have any specific questions about the market or anything, I'm happy to answer.
I just wanted to say absolutely start earlier, because I started writing my statement in October and it's been like incredibly stressful, mostly in trying to get the feedback from my advisors and collaborators. Because of course, if you give someone a 2 weeks window and they're pretty busy, it's hard. And so I almost submitted some application with no feedback, and that was really stressing me out. So just start earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm like really neurotic, so I started writing my statements like in June. I think I had a draft to my advisor like maybe mid-July, and had sent it to my letter writers and stuff by early August. And I think I just got so much good feedback from different people. It gave me the space to like, share it with people at Caltech who are like outside my area. And I felt much more confident submitting it, having kind of all of this diverse feedback on it. Though also I got really conflicting advice. And actually there was a huge, so I do really interdisciplinary work, right? And I think Julia does as well, so she relates to this. I definitely had some set of the people that I sent my statement to who were like, "Oy, you might want to like step back all that ecology stuff. Like you're going to scare people away. Like you want to make sure that they think that you're a real computer scientist. And you're not going to be like running off to the field all the time." And I thought about it and I was like, okay, I could like frame this story differently. I could try to really frame it from the computer science first and then like talk about ecology as if it was like, look at the cool applications. But in the end, it didn't feel true to like what I actually think of my research being and like what I want to do going forward. And I was like, you know what, screw it. Like I'll write this statement like from a very honest space of like, this is really what I want to do, right? Like I want to do interdisciplinary work. And I'll treat that as a filter. So like if people don't want that, then they won't make me an offer. And I think in the end, that was really the right decision. I think I think that the world is changing a bit and that there's more openness to non-traditional approaches and more open to other fields in computer science, or at least based on like the feedback I got and the offers that I got. So don't let old school people scare you into selling yourself short in a way.
Okay, so we are running out of time. If there's any other question, I'm sure Sara will be very happy to take it offline or.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
feel free
if you're
to email
interested
me.
in that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And she put the Slack also, so if you're interested in that, you can just join. And thank you very much, Sara. I don't know if Eric or Ricardo Antonio wants to do some closing remarks. Otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just one brief thing. If you also want to mention other initiatives apart from the Slack channel.
I work a lot with queer and AI, which is awesome. So if anyone else is queer here, we're going to do a little informal meetup at CVPR next week. If you're queer and in computer vision, which is like a bit of a niche, but and I also, I think that, well, yeah, like I said, I really care about DEI, and regardless of where you are, I think that there's so much room to improve. And there's definitely initiatives at your own universities, wherever they are, where you can play a part.
Perfect. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much, Sara.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice presentation. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. All the best to you.